They didn't know I was standing behind the door when they said it. My own mother's voice, calm, steady, almost relieved, whispered, Viana's absence makes everything easier. She's always been the problem. That sentence landed harder than any disaster zone I'd ever survived. It wasn't anger I felt. It was recognition. A truth I'd tried to outrun for years finally caught me. That even in my own home, I had never been wanted, only tolerated. And as they laughed in the next room, unaware I could hear every word, something inside me cracked in a way that wouldn't heal. My name is Viana Crest, and this is the moment everything began to unravel. The moment I stepped out of the terminal at Santa Rosa, the air felt different, lighter, colder, and far too familiar. I hadn't been back in years. Yet the drive toward Mendocino wound through me like a memory I couldn't quite shake. The road curved through towering pines before opening to the coastline, the kind of view people romanticize, unless they grew up here with the weight of old stories they never asked for. With every mile, an old tightness gathered at the base of my throat, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what awaits you. But going anyway. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my family's house, the sky had turned a soft gray. My mother met me at the door. She wrapped her arms around me, but her hands fell away almost as soon as they'd touched my back, as if she'd remembered something halfway through the embrace. Clarabelle followed behind her, greeting me with the kind of polite smile people reserve for distant relatives and holiday acquaintances. Nothing in her voice carried warmth, only formality dressed up as courtesy. Inside, the house hadn't changed. Not the creaking wood floor, not the faint smell of lemon polish, not the way everything felt paused in time, waiting to be picked apart again. At the dining table, my chair sat at the far edge, angled slightly away from the others. No one mentioned it, but the placement said enough. Then Ethan Maddox stepped forward. His handshake was firm, steady, lingering just a heartbeat too long. His eyes held mine with an intensity that felt like recognition, though we'd never met. Before I could make sense of it, Clarabelle leaned closer, her voice low and composed. Just don't talk too much about your work tonight, she said softly. People won't really get it. It was a small comment, gentle even, but it sliced cleanly. The first quiet reminder that whatever welcome I thought I might find here was never truly waiting for me. Dinner felt more like a performance than a homecoming. Everyone spoke loudly enough to fill the silence I wasn't invited to break, each voice dancing around me while pretending not to notice the empty space I occupied. My mother, sitting primly at the head of the table, launched into a glowing monologue about how steady and well-planned Clarabelle's life had become. Every compliment felt pointed, like she was lining them up beside me to measure the difference. No one asked where I'd flown in from, how long I would stay, or whether I was well. Instead, a distant uncle leaned forward, squinting over his glasses as if peering at an old rumor. I heard about that situation years back. Shame how all that turned out, he said. His voice dipped in false sympathy. The table stilled just enough for the words to settle. Clarabelle didn't hesitate. She lowered her voice, but not enough to miss. She walked away from the mission. That's what people said. There was no malice in her tone, only certainty, as if she were reciting a fact the whole family had agreed upon. Across the table, Ethan lifted his head. His expression sharpened, the kind of subtle shift a trained eye can't hide. It wasn't judgment, it was confusion. A quiet recognition that something in the story didn't line up. I felt his gaze on me, steady and questioning, as if he were listening for the real version beneath the noise. My mother didn't defend me. She didn't correct them. Her silence slid across the table like a verdict, familiar and heavy, informing everyone that my absence in the past had been deserved. In that moment, I realized nothing had changed. The same legend they'd built about me, the flawed one, was still alive and well. Then Ethan leaned back, thoughtful, almost unsettled. He'd heard a name, a location, a fragment buried in the conversation that mirrored something he already knew, something a SEAL commander once mentioned about a woman who'd held a collapsing operation together with sheer will. I saw the recognition spark behind his eyes, faint but undeniable, and judging from the way he kept looking at me afterward, I knew he had begun connecting pieces my family had worked very hard to scatter. The next afternoon, after Clarabelle insisted on showing Ethan the scenic overlook behind the restaurant hosting the engagement party, he and I fell into step beside each other as she trailed ahead snapping photos. The wind whipped off the Pacific, carrying the chill of old memories I'd rather not revisit. Ethan walked quietly for a while before asking, almost casually, "Did you ever work in Jordan around 2010? I didn't break stride. "I've worked in a lot of places," I said, keeping my tone even. It's hard to remember every assignment. It was the truth, but also an evasion, and he seemed to hear both. His eyes drifted to my wrist, where a thin, pale scar curved along the bone, a souvenir from a night spent hauling rope through rubble while dust choked the air. He didn't ask about it, but the flicker in his gaze told me he recognized the type. People like him usually did. Before he could say more, Aunt Alice joined us, pressing a hand to her back as she caught her breath. "Your folks never should have kept quiet about that commendation," she muttered, acting like praising you would somehow overshadow your sister. I never understood that. Clarabelle spun around so fast, her hair whipped across her shoulder, the color in her cheeks drained, replaced by a sharp, startled anger. She hadn't expected anyone to mention it, not here, not in front of Ethan. He stopped walking altogether. For a moment, he simply stared at me, as if the missing half of a story he'd been chasing had just fallen into his hands. No question, no accusation, just understanding, quiet and sudden. And in that charged silence, I knew he had recognized something my own family refused to see. The truth they had buried was already rising back to the surface. The engagement party buzzed with music and champagne. But the moment I stepped into the cocktail area, the tone sharpened. Behind me, a cluster of Clarabelle's friends chatted loudly enough for the words to land on my shoulders. Women over 50 still drifting around. No family, no stability. One said. Another added, "Hard to believe someone like that is related to Clarabelle." Clarabelle slipped in beside them, offering a polite smile that carried not even a hint of defense. Their laughter grew bolder. A woman raised her voice just enough I heard she walked off a major mission once. Unbelievable. I stayed silent, though inside, a familiar ache uncoiled. Then my mother approached. For a heartbeat, I thought she might stop it. Instead, she placed a hand on Clarabelle's arm. "She's lucky," she said warmly. "Found someone reliable with a real future." She said it while standing right next to me. A man lifted his glass. Women like that who'd put up with them running everywhere, never taking responsibility. Clarabelle kept smiling, but Ethan stilled completely. Breath pausing for just a second, I caught it, even if others didn't. Another whisper floated over, "Amazing, she's even her sister." It landed with the weight of a sentence. I felt myself slipping into that younger version of me, the one shaped by their assumptions rather than my truth. I was seconds from retreating when Ethan set his drink down with a soft, deliberate click. He stepped closer. He looked at the man and asked, calm but razor sharp, "What exactly do you know about that mission?" The room froze. The man swallowed. "I heard it from her family." A crack split the air, small, but enough to change everything. Later, near one of the tall windows, a retired serviceman recounted a story. There was a woman who coordinated Meridian. Tough as steel, saved lives. I didn't move. Years of silence had trained me well. Ethan joined the circle. "Where'd you hear that?" "From an old SEAL," the man replied. "Anyone who was there knows who she was." Then Ethan spoke a name almost no civilian would know, Colonel Harker. The veteran nodded immediately. He praised her more than anyone. Clarabelle cut in fast. She only coordinated things. People exaggerate. For the first time. Ethan looked at her without warmth. A nearby guest murmured, "If she was that important, why didn't her family ever say so?" A brutal question, a fair one. Ethan turned to me. "Did you work with Harker?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Silence can be louder than truth. He exhaled slowly, understanding settling into his expression. And in that moment, I knew he'd begun to see what my family had spent years burying. The music shifted before anyone else did. The warm jazz that had carried the party through its early hours thinned into something sharper, colder, as the light softened from gold to a pale, unforgiving white. It was subtle, but enough to make every smile feel tighter, every glance shorter than polite. Behind me, Clarabelle's friends clustered together, their voices floating just loud enough to reach. She's barely walked in and already looks like she doesn't belong, one said. Another snickered. Well, does she? Clarabelle drifted toward them, the diamond on her hand catching the light as she lifted it just so. She turned her head toward me with a sweetness that felt rehearsed. Not everyone gets to have this, she said lightly, as if commenting on the weather, but the glance she gave me told a harsher truth. It wasn't an accident, it was a hierarchy. A guest approached me, swirling his drink. So what do you do that keeps you away all the time? He asked. Doesn't it bother you? Not having anyone waiting for you? I'm comfortable with how I live, I said. He laughed. Comfortable. At your age, people need stability, not wandering around. Before I could step away, another voice cut through the room. Didn't she put her whole team at risk once? Left them hanging? The question cracked across the party like a gunshot. Clarabelle stared into her champagne, offering no correction. Her silence was endorsement. And then my mother appeared, moving slowly, as though unsure where to stand. For one hopeful second, I thought she might dismiss the rumor. Instead, she said softly, Viana, if you had been more responsible, things would have turned out differently. The words didn't slap, they settled like dust on old wounds that had never properly healed. Then came the shift. Ethan placed his drink on the nearest table. The sound was small but clean, cutting through every conversation. He moved into the circle that had formed around me, not aggressively, but with a precision that silenced everyone. Who told you that he asked the man who had accused me? His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The man pointed toward Clarabelle. Her eyes widened, the first crack in her flawless composure. For the first time that night, she looked afraid. And I stood there in the center of the room, not on a battlefield made of sand and smoke, but one built from years of misjudgment, wondering how long my own family had been feeding a story that had nothing to do with who I really was. Ethan didn't let the moment dissolve. He faced the group directly, his voice steady. Meridian, he said. What do you all know about it? Silence fell like a curtain. The name alone drew stiff shoulders and shifting eyes. It wasn't something civilians tossed around. Even among those who understood it carried weight and secrecy. A retired serviceman cleared his throat. I heard about a woman who coordinated Meridian, kept a disastrous situation from turning deadly. They said dozens survived because of her. His gaze drifted toward me, quiet but deliberate. Clarabelle forced a laugh. People exaggerate. Stories get blown up. But Ethan cut her off. Colonel Harker doesn't exaggerate. The room froze. That name was never spoken lightly. A woman near the back whispered, if she was that important, why didn't her family ever mention it? My mother's face blanched. Because those things bring tension. It wasn't good for harmony. The meaning behind her words landed with brutal clarity. Harmony meant keeping me small. Harmony meant keeping Clarabelle untouchable. Ethan turned to my mother. So you protected harmony instead of the truth. She couldn't answer. Her hands trembled at her sides. Then he looked at me. Really looked. Did you work with Colonel Harker? The room held its breath. I didn't answer. Not aloud. I simply met his eyes steady, unflinching, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A nod that shattered a decade of lies. A nod that rewrote everything my family had told the world about me. In the silence that followed, I felt stripped bare, not exposed in shame, but seen in a way I hadn't been in years. Ethan wasn't looking at me as someone's sister, someone's burden, someone's rumor. He was looking at me as someone who mattered, someone whose truth was finally rising to the surface. The second my nod landed, the room didn't just go quiet, it froze. Ethan's posture shifted with a precision that stole every remaining sound. His shoulders squared, his heels clicked together, and before I could even inhale, his right hand lifted in a sharp and flawless arc. He saluted me. At my sister's engagement party, conversation died mid-sentence. Even the music seemed to vanish into the walls. A little boy whispered, "Dad, what's he doing?" "Showing respect," his father murmured. "Real respect." Behind them, a champagne flute slipped from Clarabelle's hand and shattered. My mother pressed trembling fingers to her lips, tears spilling in silent shock years of denial cracking open at once. When Ethan lowered his hand, his voice carried through the room with a weight that pulled every gaze toward him. If it weren't for her, half my team wouldn't be alive. A ripple like someone had struck the room dead center. Meridian wasn't a failure, he continued. It was a rescue mission, and she— He turned fully toward me, steady, certain. "She's the reason we came home. No one dared move. No one dared speak." I stayed still, letting the silence do what words never could, finally, undeniably. "Tell the truth." The echo of Ethan's salute was still hanging in the room when he stepped forward, steady and controlled, as if he'd trained his whole life for this moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet around him was absolute. She wasn't a bystander in Meridian. He began. She was the lead coordinator. A few heads jerked up. Someone inhaled sharply. She stayed on site when others evacuated. He continued. She pulled trapped servicemen from debris with her own hands. She took injuries and still directed the rescue routes. And when the commendation came, he paused, his eyes flicking toward me. She refused it, to protect the locals who risked their lives helping us. No one shifted. No one whispered. Several guests lowered their gazes, as if looking at me suddenly required a kind of courage. Ethan's voice softened. Her family never honored her, but the ones who survived. We never forgot. A stunned murmur rippled through the room. Then a guest near the back said quietly, "So all these years, we were wrong?" Another answered, sharper, "No, we were led wrong." Dozens of eyes turned toward my family, like a tide. Clarabelle's first tear wasn't remorse, just fury. "This was supposed to be my night," she cried. "Why do you always have to take over everything?" Her voice cracked in a way that made even her closest friends step back. Ethan looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, and not liking what he saw. My mother broke next. Tears streamed as she whispered, "I just wanted peace in the family. I didn't want comparisons." Her voice collapsed into her hands. Years of choices misguided, cowardly finally, crumbling under their own weight. Ethan turned to the two of them, his words low but unyielding. "The truth never divides a family, but the way you hid it." That did. Silence claimed the room again. And as I stood there, surrounded by the shards of every lie ever told about me, I felt something bittersweet slip through my chest. I had been given back my honor, yes, but the belief that my family would someday understand me, that illusion died right there on that polished floor. The house felt hollow the morning after, too still, too careful, as if everyone inside was afraid a single sound might shatter whatever fragile sense of normalcy remained. I didn't sleep much, not because I was upset, but because for the first time in years, there was nothing left inside me to fight. The truth was out, and it belonged to the room now. I didn't need to carry it anymore. Before the sun fully rose, I slipped outside and followed the familiar path to the cliffs. The air was cold enough to sting, the kind of cold that wakes every part of you at once. When I reached the edge, the Pacific opened wide beneath me, the water shifting from deep blue to gold as the first light stretched across the horizon. It looked like a beginning, not a grand one, but a quiet, earned beginning. I heard footsteps behind me. Ethan stopped a few feet away, giving me space but offering presence. He didn't look like a Navy SEAL then, or a fiancé, or even a man caught in the middle of a family unraveling. He looked like someone who had witnessed something he couldn't walk away from. "We owe you our lives," he said softly. "All of us." There was no ceremony in his tone, no attempt at comfort, just truth. And it settled into me like warmth. When we walked back, the house felt different, smaller. Clarabelle stood just behind the screen door, shoulders trembling. She met my eyes for barely a second before looking away. She wanted to speak, her face said as much, but pride sealed her mouth shut. I didn't push her. Some lessons aren't mine to teach. My mother stepped onto the porch, stopping a careful distance from me. Her hands shook. Her eyes were full of apologies she didn't know how to form. She breathed in, steeling herself, but nothing came out. The silence between us wasn't angry, it was tired. Worn down from years of pretending, I gave her a small, quiet smile. Not an invitation, not forgiveness, just release. Ethan watched all of it unfold, and when our eyes met, he said, "You don't owe anyone an explanation anymore." It was the final truth I needed. By mid-morning, I packed my things. No lingering, no dramatic exit. I simply walked out the door, the weight of the past not following me this time. Mendocino didn't feel like a wound anymore, just a place I had once lived inside too long. I drove toward the airport with the windows cracked, the wind sweeping through the car in cool bursts, carrying away everything I no longer needed. I wasn't running. I wasn't grieving. I was choosing myself, choosing a life where I didn't need someone else's approval to exist, choosing purpose, not performance, choosing peace. And as the cliffs disappeared behind me, the truth settled gently into my bones. Freedom isn't the absence of pain. It's the moment you stop asking permission to heal.